So yeah, it was a small town and there wasn't a lot to do, Steve. So I discovered books very quickly. It also helped that I was stuck indoors during school holidays, where it rained. And there were a lot of classics in my family home, right? The Dickens, the Mark Twains, and I kind of munched through all of that. When that was done, went through the Children's Britannica, munched through that, and went through the Adult Encyclopedia, munched through that, and then kind of ran out of books. And the books in my town, the bookstore in my town was really the kind of store that sold stationery and
Hmm.
sold textbooks. So the turning point, and it's such a small thing, but it was a big thing for me. My dad was in the Rotary Club, and one day, this giant shipment of 12 tea chests full of library books arrived. In Global Teacher, we talk about how books get sent manually to, well, we were the recipient of one of those, and those boxes were meant to go to the local library. But the local library said to my dad, hey, sorry, we don't have space right now. Can you hang on to the boxes for us? And my dad said, well, if you're going to hang on to it, you might as well crack it open. And Steve, I'll never forget my dad with the hammer and the chisel cracking open that tea chest and the smell of tea that wafted out of that box. I'll forever associate books with tea. And inside that box were books by Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Stephen Donaldson, Julian May, Nigel Tranter, who wrote a lot of books about Scotland and Scottish clans. Maybe I would have discovered that in later years,
Hmm.
but I was 9 or 10 at the time, and these were books that and worlds that I was now privileged to explore. And so when I talked about, I was dreaming about the world. What sort of happened was three things. Number one, I had a time limit. In my mind, the
Right.
library was going to ask for those books back. So I had to read really quickly, right? So there was this huge determination that I was going to learn how to read and I was going to learn how to read fast. So somehow taught myself to speed read. I don't know how, but I was powering through those books really, really quickly. And I wasn't daunted by the size of the books or
Hmm.
the how tiny the text was. So that was one thing. The second thing was that I was ingesting vocabulary at a phenomenal rate. And I hadn't realized that my little 9, 10-year-old brain was just absorbing all of this language. It didn't come out when I spoke,
Hmm.
but it came out when I wrote.
Wow.
And you could see that my level of written English was really very high. And I kind of downplayed that when I was growing up because, you kind of don't want to stand out. But I realized that much later. But also what was happening was that I had a theoretical view of the world. I was a interplanetary pilot for a space pod. I was a military commander who was horribly, sort of outnumbered, right, by the enemy. I was a botanist in a mining community. So I had all these jobs that people were doing and solving for in these books. And later on, I realized this was all like locked up in my head. But when the time came to strategize, to
Hmm.
solve problems, to think of a plan A and a plan B and a plan C, it just came really naturally. And I think back, I kind of think it's because I had all that stories and problems and things that I was solving in my head. So
No, that's cool. Because one of the things that just listening to what you're talking about, how enthusiastically you're talking about stuff, is that I think culturally, and I'll generalize, but I think a lot of children, me included, in the UK and the US, and maybe a lot of places in Europe, take it for granted. So, for instance, I wasn't a reader, but I also know a lot of kids aren't. They play on the phone, they're on social media, they're doing whatever. And it's almost where, there's a guy that's on the roadmap course that I do, but almost he grew up in Singapore. But actually, I do think in different parts of the world, the culture and the approach to learning is different. Don't get me wrong, I think yours is so much better than here, but it's almost where I think people that grow up in the UK or somewhere else almost take it for granted what we have. They don't know that kind of thing. Or likewise, a lot of people don't read. And I only really kind of discovered reading probably after university, so in my 20s or so. But for me, it was
mm,
always about personal development stuff. I'm an engineer, but it's almost fact-based stuff is what kind of gets me going.
right,
But it's
right.
just fascinating to hear you talk because I don't think a lot of people are like that, but what it also does, it kind of shows the character traits that you're obviously very keen to learn and get involved, but you also fundamentally appreciate the benefit that knowledge can bring to people if they have access to it. Have you ever thought about how different your life could have been if your parents didn't have National Geographic or those tea crates didn't turn up?
Oh, all the time. Actually, I thank my parents all the time as well, because it was so interesting when the time came to move to Belfast. I was so confident. I felt so prepared, but no one had set me aside and said, okay,
Mm-hmm.
here's how to speak English, or here's how the accent's going to be, or here's what's going to be different. And instead I arrived, and yes, the Northern Irish accent was very different, but I had enough of a comfort with English that I could quickly hear the different things and not be confused and completely adapt. So, or 100% I would credit that to uh, the theoretical knowledge that I had gained from books. And then the missing piece was then completing that theory
Mm-hmm.
with real life. And that was also a great opportunity.